Hello friends, and welcome back. Today was going to be a very different kind of video when I started out with this project, but what it has turned into is kind of a discussion on disappointment. Have you ever made something that you were really excited to start, and then by the time you were finished, you felt like it was a steaming pile of garbage? That's how I felt about this jacket. I was excited to start it. I love the wool that I used. It was a gift from my grandmother-in-law, and it gave me a chance to try out the rotary cutter and cutting mat that my mother-in-law got me for my birthday. But ultimately, what I ran into was a problem with the fact that the last time I made this particular pattern, I was 19, and now I am 26, and I guess I wasn't 19. I was 20. Anyway, it was about 5 years ago, and obviously I am a different size now than I was then, and I ran into a problem of if I'd been a little more creative about laying out my pattern, I might have had enough fabric to size up the pattern for where I am now, but I didn't, so what I ended up with was a jacket that was just a little bit too tight through the shoulders, and you'll see later that I tried to fix that with some creative gores, and it just didn't really work out the way I wanted it to. This project with the highest of hopes and a very clear picture of what the finished product was going to look like in my mind. But as so often happens, the end result did not match the picture in my brain. I got my start sewing Halloween costumes with my mom, but as I got older I moved on to sewing costumes for my high school theater club, so the construction of historical garments isn't something that's new to me. Well, at least the construction of things that can pass as historical garments isn't new to me. But to be totally honest, once you know how clothing goes together, it's pretty easy to just kind of cut out the pattern pieces and go for it. I don't remember the last time I actually read the instruction packet that comes with a Big 3 pattern. But as I go further down this rabbit hole of sewing my own clothing and leaning towards the historical bent of clothing construction, I am more inclined to adopt some of the historical techniques into my own sewing practices. The sleeve that you see me pinning and cutting out right now is pieced together from two slightly smaller pieces of fabric that I stitched together and then used to cut out my sleeve pattern because I didn't have a big enough piece. And you see that in a lot of historical garments because fabric was expensive. You may also recognize the fabric that I used for the lining as the fabric that I used to line my American Duchess cape. That as creative people, it's really easy to, when you spend a long time making something and it doesn't come out exactly the way you wanted it to, especially with clothing, if it doesn't fit right or doesn't look how you want it to, it's really easy to just pass it off as a waste of time. But to be totally honest, I am actually pretty proud of the actual construction of this garment, and most of the problems that I have with it are things that most likely wouldn't really bother anyone else. My biggest problem is with the fit of the jacket, and I think most of that is due to the fact that I just didn't really have enough of the wool that I used, just the outer layer. Or maybe I did, and I just should have laid my pattern pieces out a little bit more creatively. But the biggest problem is the fact that it was super tight to the shoulders, and also the fact that the sleeves didn't fit right, and you'll see later that I tried to fix that using gauze, but I've always been bad with sleeves, so this was a real learning experience for me in the fact that I discovered I would rather sit in sleeves by hand. In the interest of adding more historical techniques into my own personal sewing habits, I flatlined this jacket, so I basted the lining and the outer pieces together and treated them as one unit. This did lead to more of the dreaded hand sewing later, but my work there with said hand sewing is actually work that I'm pretty proud of. Like I said, sizing and sleeves are really what stick out to me as glaring disappointments, leading to my opinion that this jacket is a giant trash fire, but I digress. As far as I know, historically accurate way to create a jacket like this, a 1780s-ish jacket, let's call it an outlander jacket, which I know is 1740s, but it's fine. Anyway, the historically accurate way to create a jacket like this, as far as I know, is to flatline it and then fill down the interior seams by hand later. And I didn't fill the seams because I didn't leave enough for seam allowance, but I did cover them with some other scraps of lining fabric, and ultimately that did give me a neater finished project with no little wonky lining things that I think happen a lot if you don't flatline clothes. several attempts at putting in and taking out the diddly darn sleeves on my machine, I eventually set them in by hand with a backstitch, only to then take them out once again because the jacket still didn't fit through the shoulders. Boy oh boy, how I wish I had seen the Foundations Revealed sleeve workshop before I made this jacket. But I didn't, because it hadn't come out yet. My point in making this and talking about this and uploading this is that nothing is a waste of time if you learned something, even if what you learned was what not to do. What I really learned from this project is that you should always make a mock-up, and that it's way easier to set in sleeves by hand. Side of flatlining is that then you have to go around the edges of whatever garment you're making with a braid or ribbon or something, so that you don't have just raw edges kind of flapping around in the breeze. So I took a long strip of my lining fabric and pinned it to the right side of my fabric, stitched that on my machine, and then folded it over and hand stitched it down with a rolled hem to the wrong side of the jacket, and that worked out pretty well for me. I then dug around for some scraps that were big enough to make some 4.5 by 4.5 inch gores for the underarm seams. This is not historically accurate. As far as I know, gores in the underarm were only used in undergarments like chemises and shifts, but I put them in this jacket because I like it when my arms will move. So I ripped out the underarm seam and the side seam down to a point that would allow me to put the gores in, and then I put those in by hand also. Else, making this jacket really made me work on my hand sewing. The back stitch is now, well, maybe not a friend, but definitely an acquaintance. Puppy scritches for little Jasper, who was a very good helper to me over the 4 days that it took me to make this jacket, and by helper I mean he sat on my lap and stabbed himself with pins and then looked at me like I was the one who was at fault. I had planned to just use metal grommets for the eyelets, not historically accurate, but way easier. But I made the holes too big for the little metal grommets that I had, so they were also done by hand. Fun fact about me, I hate doing eyelets by hand. This should have been the sign that I was not going to be happy with the finished product, but it wasn't, and I kept going anyway. And I think there's something to be said for that. At least I'm choosing to think there's something to be said for that, because this is a whole video about how making a jacket that I hated was not a waste of time. At least my eyelet game got better, I guess. See the inside of the jacket. You can see I've covered all of the interior seams with strips, whatever, of the lining fabric that I felled down by hand or whip. I don't know the difference between a whip stitch and a felling stitch, but either way, it definitely improved my hand sewing, and I was hand sewing much faster by the time I was finished with this part. I knew that wearing a modern bra with this was just going to make me hate it more, although at this point, since I hadn't put on the finished project yet, I kind of still was happy with it. So I put it on over a corset that I bought on Amazon roughly 3 years ago. I do have a set of stays, but they're not finished yet because I ordered the wrong amount of boning and I haven't gotten around to ordering the right amount yet. But you'll see as I put it on, there's just something weird about the fit through the shoulders and where the kind of elbow seams hit my arms is wrong. I think it's just small for me in ways that would maybe not be irritating if I wasn't such a perfectionist, but overall it just didn't fit how I wanted it to fit. I did spiral lace it, which is the historically accurate way. It means you offset the eyelet holes a little bit so that it lies, the two seams lie parallel to each other, which also didn't happen, which is again I think a fit issue. And I will say that the lacing takes forever, and I am about to skip an eyelet by accident, which is very irritating, but I promise I do notice and I do go back and fix it. was gray and cloudy. The day I filmed this, it was also like 85 degrees, which is not the best weather to be wearing a wool jacket and flannel skirt in. What I learned from this project is that mock-ups are your friend. I would make a mock-up. If I was going to do this again, I would make a mock-up. I am always going to make a mock-up from now on. This project has put me firmly in the camp of making a mock-up before you start an actual project with your actual fabric. This was the thing that I needed. I thought I didn't need to because I made the pattern before, but obviously that's not the case. Also, I would probably give myself extra seam allowance. 1, to make the pattern a little bit bigger. 2, so that I would have enough to fell down my seams instead of having to cut out more strips of lining fabric, because I feel like I wasted some lining fabric by cutting it out in a strip that I thought would be wide enough, and then it wasn't wide enough. And it would be easier if I just had enough to fell down my seams instead of having to cut strips of fabric from the lining. And I would also do something about the weird elbow bits, and I would cut this way longer, mostly sizing. Alright friends, thank you so much, and I will see you next time.